Section 1 of the History and Literature of the Early Church. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The History and Literature of the Early Church by James Orr. The Jewish and Gentile Preparations. The history of the Church may be said in strictness to begin with the day of Pentecost. The day of Pentecost, however, the conception of the Church altogether, had its antecedents. The New Jerusalem did not come down from heaven quite as it is pictured in the Apocalypse, without manifold links of connection with the past. St. Paul has this in view when he says that it was in the fullness of time that God sent forth his Son, Galatians 4, verse 4. 1. The Old Testament preparation. Manifestly, the Christian Church has a peculiar and genetic relation to the Old Testament, for the Old Testament community was also in its way a theocracy, a church. Compare Acts 7, verse 38. Hebrews 2, verse 12. The word ecclesia, used in the New Testament to designate the Christian society, is that chiefly used in the Septuagint as the equivalent of the Hebrew word kahal, assembly or congregation. Though bound up with national forms, that theocracy ever cherished in its bosom the consciousness of a universalistic destiny. Older than the national form in its existence was the patriarchal, the covenants with the fathers, and here already we have the clear enunciation of the idea that Israel was a people called with a view to the ultimate blessing of the race, Genesis 12 verse 3, chapter 18 verse 18, etc. That idea reaches its fullest expression in the glowing predictions of the prophets and the Psalms, for example Isaiah 60, Psalm 87, Revised Version. With the prophets, too, we see the rise of a new idea, the thought of a church within a church, a true and spiritual Israel within the natural Israel, which is the birth of the church idea proper. Compare Isaiah 8, verses 16 to 18. A further important step in the formation of the church consciousness was taken in the Babylonian exile, when the people, driven from their land and deprived of holy city, temple, and sacrifices, became a church in the full meaning of the word. Their return to Palestine did not annul this feature of their religious life. On the contrary, their return was marked by a new development of religious institutions, priestly government, the formation of a canon of Scripture, the rise of scribism, the reading and teaching of the law, all which prepared the way for the liberation of the church idea from its national and political form. 2. The post-exilian preparation. Of special importance in this connection are the four following series of facts. First, the rise and spread of synagogue worship. The synagogue may go back to the days of Ezra. In any case, it was a prominent institution after the return, both in Judea and in the lands of the dispersion, Acts 15 verse 21. We note about it, in contrast with the temple, its local character, giving it practical universality, its simple and spiritual worship, reading of law and prophets, reciting of prayers, singing or rather chanting of psalms, a discourse or exhortation in which the passage read was expounded and applied, a concluding blessing, and the absence of all priestly or sacerdotal offices. The officials were the elders, probably identical in towns with the civic elders, the archysynagogos, or ruler, one or more, who had the charge of the public worship, the minister or servant, Luke 4 verse 20, corresponding to the modern sacristan or beadle, collector of alms, with an interpreter, targumist, to give the sense of the lessons in the current Aramaic. There was considerable freedom in the service, the scriptures were read, the prayers recited, the exhortations given, not by officials, but by persons selected from the congregation, Luke 4 verses 16 to 20, Acts 13 verse 15. The resemblance to a simple Christian service is obvious. Second, the rise of the Jewish sects. The greater part of the period after the exile is an absolute blank in our knowledge. The one thing certain is that, from the time of Ezra, the nation set before it as its ideal the strict observance of the law of Moses. Hence the rise of an order of men whose special business it was to guard, develop, and expound the law, the order of the scribes. When the curtain lifts again in the time of Antiochus Epiphanes, B.C. 175, we find ourselves in a different atmosphere, and the three parties of historical note among the Jews are already in existence. The Pharisees first appear as a party of protest against the lax Hellenizing tendencies of the period. The name they bore, Assadeans, Hebrew Hasidim, denotes them as the strictly pious or Puritans of their day. Parties of this kind, however, are peculiarly liable to degeneration, and in their exaggerated scrupulosity and excessive literalism, the Assadeans soon sank into the Pharisees, separated, as we know them in the Gospels. The Sadducees, probably from Zadok, on the other hand, were not a religious party at all, but simply a political or aristocratic clique, into whose possessions the honours of the high priesthood and other influential offices hereditarily passed. They represent the worldly wise, diplomatic, time-serving party in the state, men of sceptical, rationalistic temper and Epicurean in their view of life. They disappear after the fall of Jerusalem. Of much greater importance for the history of the Church, though not mentioned in the Gospels, is the third of these parties, the Essenes. These had their chief settlement in the desert of En-Gedi, on the northwest shore of the Dead Sea, but were found also in the towns and villages throughout Palestine. Their total number was about 4,000. At En-Gedi they lived as a sort of brotherhood with customs of their own. They offered no animal sacrifices, contenting themselves with sending to the temple gifts of incense. They abounded in lustrations and wore white garments. They rejected marriage and practiced community of goods. Their employments were chiefly agricultural, but in the towns they exercised trades. They had the peculiar custom, perhaps oriental, of greeting the sunrise with prayers. They forbade slavery, war, and oaths, and were given to occult studies, had secret doctrines, and books, etc. The superficial resemblances have led some to trace Christianity itself to Essene sources, but in fundamental ideas no systems could be more opposed. We shall see that Essenism probably became ultimately merged in a form of Christianity. Third, the Judaism of the Dispersion. The Dispersion had its origin in the captivities, but was more due to voluntary settlements for trade. The Greek rulers did everything they could to attract settlers to their newly founded cities, and the troubles in Palestine made multitudes willing to leave their native country. Thus it came about that there was hardly a land or city where Jews were not to be found. They sometimes had rights of citizenship, and in many places, as in Alexandria, enjoyed special privileges. The effect on the Jew himself was profoundly and insensibly to modify his whole manner of thought. A freer spirit was necessarily introduced. From being a citizen of Zion, he became a citizen of the world. The dispersion provided points of contact for Christianity through the spread of the synagogues. Compare Acts, Passim. The circulation of the Jewish scriptures in the Greek tongue, above all through the creation of a large body of proselytes. But outside the circle of proselytes proper, there was in most communities a following of converts, the devout persons of the New Testament, Acts 10 verses 2 and 22, chapter 13 verses 16 and 26, etc., who, while attending the synagogues, only observed the Mosaic law in certain leading points, for example the Sabbath. Many of the first converts of the gospel were drawn from this class. It is noteworthy that the admission of proselytes was not only by circumcision and sacrifice, but by baptism, and if Talmudic statements are to be trusted, the children of proselytes were baptized with their parents. Fourth, the contact of Jewish thought, particularly at Alexandria, with Hellenic culture and philosophy. The classical name here is Philo, though the elements of Philo's doctrine are already met with in the apocryphal Book of Wisdom. Philo was born about BC 20 and lived till near the middle of the 1st century. He was therefore a contemporary of both Christ and St. Paul. Profoundly versed in Greek philosophy and literature, he sought to bring about an amalgamation of Jewish and Greek modes of thought. His characteristic doctrine is that of the Logos, or Word of God, whom he conceives of partly in Platonic and Stoical fashion, but whom at the same time, following hints of the Old Testament and of the Jewish schools, he tends to hypostatize or interpose as a distinct personality between God and his creation. His doctrine has often been compared with that of the Apostle John. There are, however, radical contrasts. The Apostle has his feet on historical facts. John 1 verse 14, 1 John 1 verses 1 to 3. Philo's theory would have repelled an incarnation. 3. Providential mission of Greece and Rome. The splendor of Athens in the age of Pericles should not blind us to the fact that for Greece as a whole the 5th century BC was an age of decline. The great colonizing energy of Greece was in the previous century. The mission of the Greeks was not to be the rulers but the intellectual educators of mankind. The rule passed to Macedonia, and for a brief moment it seemed as if Alexander's dream of a Greek empire of the world was to be realized. His empire fell to pieces at his death, but his great design was fulfilled of diffusing Greek letters and culture wherever his arms had gone. Rome gradually gathered up the fragments of the Macedonian Empire, but Rome herself yielded to the intellectual supremacy of Greece. It cannot be too firmly grasped how profoundly Greek influences had taken possession of the Roman Empire at the beginning of the Christian era. Greek language, Greek philosophy, Greek literature, Greek culture was everywhere. Rome itself was at this time in great measure what Juvenal calls it, a Greek city. It is a fact which may not always strike us that the epistle to the Romans was written in Greek. While, however, profoundly influenced by Greece, Rome's providential mission was different from hers. It was the task of Greece to show what the human mind can do at its highest and best in the way of natural development, to teach the world the elements of her own culture and civilization, to give it a language fitted for every noble purpose of thought and life. It was the function of Rome to bind the nations together in a great political unity, to weld them by strong bonds of law and government into a vast universal commonwealth. The practical instinct of the Roman people and their genius for government enabled them to accomplish this as no other people of the world could have done. It is no chance coincidence that the hour of the completion of this great political fabric was also that of the birth of Christianity, that the two events almost completely synchronized. The world empire and the world religion came into being together. 4. The Greek preparation. The very intensity of the intellectual development in Athens tended to hasten a moral dissolution. The Greek religion was not one which would bear looking at critically. The popular theology in Greece was simply that of the poems of Homer. When this is said, it is easy to see that its foundations must have been swept away the moment men began to inquire rationally into the causes of things and to entertain more elevated moral conceptions. Morality in the older period had rested largely on tradition, on custom. Now a spirit of inquiry had set in which would allow nothing to custom. A class of popular educators, the sophists, had arisen, who had no difficulty in dissolving the most cherished beliefs in the play of their sceptical dialectic. Other causes aided the collapse. Even the innovation of morals by the refinement and luxury of the prosperous period was not so fatal to moral life as the long-continued and exhausting wars of states, with their woeful lack of principle in public men, the constant breach of faith in treaties, the strife of factions and like evils. But Greece had a more important service to do for Christianity than simply to reveal the depths of her own moral impotence. The preparation had a positive side as well. With the overthrow of the old religion, there was going on the part of the nobler spirits, a search for a more rational and abiding foundation for religion. With the overthrow of the old morality, there began with Socrates the search for a deeper ground of morality in man's own nature. With the breaking up of the old states, there was seen in Stoicism the rise of the conception of a state or commonwealth based on reason, wide as the world and embracing man in a new brotherhood. In these three directions, therefore, first, a more inward view of morality; second, the recognition of a common nature in man and the reaching out to a universal form of society; and third, a tendency to monotheism, clearly discernible in all the nobler minds, we are to look for the positive preparation for Christianity in the ancient world. But all these advances of the human spirit could not avert the dissolution of beliefs and morals. The note of uncertainty in later Greek philosophy is very marked. Sceptical schools. The most earnest minds were those who felt it most deeply. Dissatisfied with human opinion, they felt, as Plato phrases it, the need of some, quote, word of God, which would more surely carry them. Phaedo. 5. The Roman preparation. If the philosophy of Greece could not save Greece itself, it was not to be expected that it would be able to save Rome. The Romans were a people of graver, more serious disposition than the Greeks. They had not the quick, versatile imagination of the Greeks. Their gods were mostly personifications of abstract ideas, justice, pity, clemency, pleasure, and the like. Religion was to them a very serious part of the business of life, to be engaged in with strict formality and punctilious observance of prescribed rites. Their gods were viewed, too, as more really the guardians of fidelity and virtue in household and state than among the Greeks. All testimonies accordingly bear witness to the severe virtue and simple manners of the early Romans. This simplicity did not endure. With the growth of power, especially after the fall of Carthage and Corinth, there was a great inrush of foreign customs. The Greek gods came with the Greek culture, and a change took place in Roman religion for the worse. Altered conditions in the state cooperated to bring about deterioration of morals. The old distinction of patrician and plebeian was supplanted by that of rich and poor. The wars destroyed agricultural industry and threw the land into the hands of wealthy men who farmed their estates by gangs of slaves. Slavery became the basis of the social structure, and labor was despised as beneath the dignity of citizens. The populace were supported by doles from the state, or largesses from nobles, and lived only to be fed and amused. Quote, bread and games, end quote, Juvenal. The sanguinary spectacles of the amphitheatre fostered in them a cruel and bloodthirsty spirit. Marriage lost its sacredness, and licentiousness flooded society. What all this meant for religion, it is not difficult to foresee. The chief features in a religious respect are, first, the wide prevalence of skepticism, or total unbelief among the cultured or educated classes, and second, the vast growth of superstition and a great influx of foreign cults among the people in general. The cults chiefly in favour were the Oriental, and this again shows that the religious consciousness had entered on a deeper phase. For whatever the defects of the Oriental religion, there was expressed in most of them a deeper feeling of the discord, the pain, the mystery of life, and many of their rites showed a longing for redemption. Special importance attaches to the rise of an entirely new cult, the worship of the emperor. In Caesar worship, the religion of paganism may be said to have culminated. The Roman people had long been familiar with the idea of a genius of the republic. Now, when all powers and offices were gathered up in the emperor, he became to ordinary eyes an almost godlike being. From this the step was easy to formal apotheosis. The Senate took this step when they decreed divine honours to the emperors, many of them the basest and vilest of mankind. Yet this worship of the emperor took root, and in the provinces especially gained amazing popularity. A special class of guilds, Augustales, sprang up to attend to it. The peculiarity of it was that it was the one worship which was common to the whole empire. In it also the Roman Empire expressed its inmost spirit. As the deification of brute power, it was the strongest possible antithesis to the worship of Christ. It was the worship of the beast. Luxurious, frivolous, sceptical, and corrupt as the age was, however, there is not to be overlooked in it the presence of certain better elements. As in Greece, so here the preparation was not wholly negative. Stoicism and Platonism had received a religious tinge, Seneca, Plutarch, and exercised an elevating influence on the purer minds. There were, doubtless, numerous individual examples of virtue, the collegia, organized associations or guilds of the empire, and the mysteries have intimate and curious relations with the history of the Church in the first centuries. Dr. Hatch would explain from the former several of the offices of the early Church. The mysteries of Mithras, Professor Harnack says, were in the 3rd century the strongest rival of Christianity. The burial societies were legal, and the Christians took advantage of this for their protection. When all is said, the verdict of history on that old world must be that it was as corrupt as it could well be to exist at all, and what was worse, had not within itself any principle of regeneration. 6. Christianity and Roman law. What is sometimes said of the tolerance of the Romans requires to be taken with considerable modification. The Romans had laws enough against foreign rites. Even where the practice of a foreign religion was permitted, this permission did not extend to Romans. Christianity therefore fell under the ban of the laws in a double respect. It was unsanctioned, religio illicita, and it drew away Romans from the established religion. Even with this disadvantage, however, it might have escaped, for the authorities found it impracticable rigidly to enforce the laws. But there were special features about Christianity which, from a Roman standpoint, made tolerance impossible. Christianity was not a national religion. The sentiment of antiquity respected the gods of other nations, but Christianity appeared rather in the light of a revolt against the ancient faith from which it sprang, and had no national character of its own. It had no visible deity or temple, and to the popular mind seemed a species of atheism. Specially, it could not fail to be seen that with its exclusive claims, it struck at the very existence of the Roman state religion. If its precepts were admitted, the state religion would be overthrown. The more earnest men were, therefore, to maintain or revive the prestige of the established system, the more determinedly must they oppose this new superstition. The irreconcilability of Christianity with the established religion came naturally to its sharpest point in the refusal of Christians to offer at the shrine of the emperor. This was an act of disobedience in a vital respect which could not be passed over. Add to this the manner in which Christianity came into conflict with the laws prohibiting secret and nocturnal gatherings, the powerful material interests affected by its spread, compare Acts 19 verses 24 to 27, the odium in which Christians were held on account of the crimes imputed to them by their enemies, the outbursts of popular fury to which they were exposed in times of public calamity, and it will readily be understood how, even when there was no general persecution, they lived in a constant state of insecurity, and how the very name of Christian should be held sufficient to condemn them. Points for inquiry and study. Compare synagogue and church, services, offices, etc. Compare Essenism and Christianity. Give a fuller account of Philo, and compare his doctrine with St. John's prologue. Show how with Socrates and after him moral thinking in Greece took an inward turn. Illustrate monotheism among Greeks and Romans. Read Tertullian's contrast of Christian meetings with heathen collegia. Apology, chapter 39. Find out more about the mysteries and their relation to the Church. Illustrate the position of Christians in the Roman Empire from Pliny's letter to Trajan and the apologies of Justin Martyr and Tertullian. The following books may be consulted on the subjects of this chapter, besides the church histories, Neander, etc., and articles in Bible dictionaries, Edersheim's Jesus the Messiah, Döllinger's Jew and Gentile, Uhlhorn's Conflict of Christianity, Pressense's Ancient World and Christianity, Fisher's Beginnings of Christianity, Schürer's Jewish People, etc., Lightfoot on Essenes, Commentary on Colossians, Freeman's Chief Periods of European History, Loring Bruce's Gesta Christi and the Unknown God, Schmidt's Social Results of Early Christianity, Hatcher's Organization of Early Christian Churches and Influence of Greek Ideas, Ramsay's Church in Roman Empire, Dill's Roman Society from Nero to Marcus Aurelius, Harnack's Expansion of Christianity, last two valuable on mysteries. End of section 1.